From the moment that rich deposits of limestone were discovered in the meadows above its shoreline, this city of roughly 7,000 inhabitants was destined to make a mark. Producing over 800,000 casts of lime in a single year, it soon became the country's #1 producer of the product. Its uniquely spacious harbor enabled it to become a force in shipping, and it was regularly among the top 4 ports of entry in the United States, with over 6,000 ships in and out of its port in 1893 alone. And as a shipbuilder, it built a vast number of quality sailing vessels, most notably the illustrious Red Jacket, the fastest clipper ship in history. In more recent years, this small and robust city rose to prominence again, this time by harvesting nearly 30 million pounds of lobster from area waters in a single year at a value exceeding $200 million. The Maine coastline rose from a sparsely populated, inhospitable region to a place of substantial historic importance in a relatively short time, thanks to its abundant natural resources and the industry of its people. This ruggedly beautiful coast is steeped in rich maritime heritage, and no place more so than a city called Rockland. Just as our nation did, Rockland began as a settlement of an older, more established entity that eventually outgrew its parent and established its own identity. Using its access to the sea through an expansive harbor, it became an industrial and maritime powerhouse, and as the passing centuries brought inevitable change, turned back to the Atlantic again and again to reinvent itself and remain the vibrant community it is today. The coast of the state of Maine is one of the most irregular in the world. A straight line running from its southernmost city to the northernmost coastal town would measure about 225 miles. If you followed the coastline between the same 2 locations, you would travel more than 10 times as far. At the time of the Ice Age, the whole area that is now Maine was part of a mountain range that towered above the sea. But as the glacier descended, it expended enormous force on those mountains, and they sank deep into the Atlantic. This is where the Maine we know today began, and as the glacier receded, it created and revealed countless islands, peninsulas, coves, and bays. The story of Rockland, Maine revolves around just one of those natural coastal formations. The first humans entered the mid-coast region of Maine about 13,000 years ago, and though the archaeological record is incomplete, it suggests that the human population of what we now call Maine was made up of a scattering of small, mobile hunting bands classified as Paleo-Indians. They and their ancestors would come to know Rockland Harbor as the great landing place, or, in their language, Catawamteek, and they traveled inland from the coast on a well-worn trail that would become essential to the prosperity of future inhabitants of the area. The early history of Rockland starts when it was an unnamed part of Thomaston, whose story begins with Captain George Weymouth and the voyage of Archangel in 1605, a voyage documented in detail by Captain Weymouth's secretary, James Rosier. In addition to exploring the area around the St. George's River for several days, including what became the Highland Meadows area of Rockland, it is now believed that the following account from Rosier's journal describes Weymouth sailing by the entrance to what became Rockland Harbor on an exploratory excursion up Penobscot Bay. The first and chief thing required is a bold coast and fair land to fall with. The next, a safe harbor for ships to ride in. The first is a special attribute to this shore, being most free from sands or dangerous rocks in a continual depth, with a most excellent landfall. For the second, by judgment of our captain, here are more good harbors for ships of all burthens than England can afford. But I would boldly affirm it to be the most rich, beautiful, large and secure harboring river that the world affords. Soon a chain of trading posts emerged along the Maine coast, one quite likely located somewhere on the St. George's River. Wherever it was, the trading post was the scene of a thriving fur trading business. The Thomaston area also attracted English vessels from Massachusetts, eager to harvest the great tall pines in the region, haul them to the shore, and convey them to England, where they were fashioned into ships' masts. The initial settlers in what became the Rockland sector of Thomaston, referred to as the Shore Village, included 12 families who took root in the decades spanning from the late 1760s to the mid-1770s. These trailblazers confronted great stands of pine, so thick that clearing space sufficient for a homestead seemed to occupy a lifetime. Not only did they build their homes, they also harvested hay, grazed cattle, raised crops, planted orchards, built businesses, and conducted trade, all of which set the stage for the accelerated development of what would emerge as the city of Rockland. This is my country. These are my people, saving of emotion, with their eyes dipped in the winter ocean. The lonely, patient ones, whose speech comes slow, whose bodies always lean toward the blow. The enduring and the clean, the tough and the clear, who live where winter is the word for year. Robert Peter Tristram Coffin. The initial wave of settlers began with the Tolman family, who arrived from Massachusetts in 1765 and took possession of 500 acres on the northern edge of Thomaston, surrounding Madam Beddock's Pond, known today as Chickawaukee Lake. The earliest businesses in this area were probably Tolman's sawmill and grist mill. 80 years later, the Shore Village sector would substantially outpace the rest of Thomaston in population, to the point where it would separate and become East Thomaston, and then the city of Rockland. From 1790 to 1850, Maine's population increased more than sixfold. Settlements spread across much of the southern half of the state, and the economy expanded rapidly. Because the sea was Maine's gateway to the rest of the nation and the world, port towns led the state's growth. But there were issues that slowed the development of a common vision for Maine's overall development, and none was more crucial than settling the issue of separation from Massachusetts. Finally, in 1820, Maine separated from Massachusetts to become the 23rd state. I am oolitic limestone, made of tons upon tons of tiny ooids, which in turn are made of grains of sand and once beautiful shells, held together by a cement of calcite, all of myself forming from a long life of constant waves, rolling along a riverbed, collecting as I continue rolling. I am a sedimentary rock, constantly changing, constantly rolling against the warm waves. Harley Coward. Rockland is appropriately named because for nearly a century the community's core economy and early prosperity depended largely on rocks. In the early 1780s, members of the Alma family moved from Waldoboro to the shore area and became the first lime burners in the future Rockland when they detected limestone near what is today's Old County Road. Lacking a convenient way to haul the rocks to the nearest kiln in Thomaston, they built their own in the shore village. Laying out a path to haul the limestone rocks to the kiln at what became the Rockland shore, they used the very same trail traveled by the area's earliest inhabitants. That trail is still in use today as Rockland's own Lime Rock Street. The lime industry would become the chief engine of Rockland's growth in the 19th century. Lime manufacturing was a lucrative but dangerous business. The danger came from the nature of the product. Heat applied to limestone produces quicklime and carbon dioxide, which is given off as a gas. The quicklime product is then reduced to small chunks of powdered lime and packed in barrels for export. When water touches quicklime, heat is the immediate result. Lots of water, such as produced by a storm, generates lots of heat, which can easily escalate to a full-scale blaze. 136 lime kilns were scattered across the highlands and along the full reach of the city's capacious waterfront. The kilns labored long hours to produce an exceptionally high-quality product that was in demand across the country, and 800,000 casks of it were produced and shipped in 1850, making Rockland the largest producer of lime in the United States. The citizens of East Thomaston voted to change the name to Rockland in 1850, following a lively contest in which the alternative names of Lime Rock, Limestone, and Rockville were also considered.
The point is the L-shaped peninsula that stretches out into Rockland Harbor along Tilson Avenue and along Winter Street. And in 1850, that year also brought water piped into the area west of Maine. And so the importers and the traders and the lime manufacturers who had been living on the point built houses and moved west of Main Street, and their houses, which did not have running water, were available then to rent to poor immigrants. And so they came. The Irish and the Italians were recruited to work in the lime kilns and quarries. There were Jews who came to escape persecution in Russia, and there were Armenians and Albanians who came to escape persecution by the Ottoman Empire. It was a wonderful area. It had sailors and immigrants and children and boarding houses and factories and wharfs and all kinds of shops. Housing was cheap. The neighbors spoke their language, and parents looked out for each other's children.
The combination of exceptionally large and rich deposits of limestone, combined with the proximity to by far the area's largest harbor and gateway to all of the major markets, put Rockland in an exceptionally strong position to become the center for the lime industry in Maine and later nationally for much of the 19th and early 20th centuries. In the wake of the growth from the lime industry came an increasing demand for larger and faster sailing vessels. In 1800, the country's leading domestic markets were strung out along the eastern seaboard. Westward expansion was in its infancy. The North Atlantic Ocean was equivalent in importance to I-95 and the rest of today's interstate highway system, and wooden sailing schooners ruled the cargo-hauling world. This put Rockland and other coastal communities blessed with large deep-water harbors in an enviable position.
Think about the turnpike. Every time you see an 18-wheeler, that would be a four-masted schooner going from place to place, carrying cargo along the coast here, from New York all the way down east to Eastport and stopping in Rockland, Maine, the northern terminus of that. You see a UPS truck out there. That was a little two-masted schooner going in and out of these little ports all along the ragged New England coast. Think about a pickup truck. My God, the pickup trucks are ubiquitous. But they were all the fishing smacks and the friendship sloops and all the little boats all along. Everything was done by sailing vessel back in those days.
In the middle of the 1800s, Maine stood at the juncture of two great streams of commerce: the transatlantic trade with Europe and the longshore links between northern and southern states and the West Indies. Maine built the ships that carried this trade and provided the crews that made America the world's premier trading nation. Maine shipyards produce more than 1/3 of the nation's shipping, including some of the finest square-rigged sailing vessels ever built. Rockland was a leader in Maine shipbuilding, much of it driven by the need for vessels to haul wood to fire the lime kilns and transport the resulting lime product to markets in Boston, New York, and beyond. 150 so-called coasters carried lime out of Rockland to ports along the Atlantic and Gulf Coast in 1850 alone. Shipyards turned out hundreds of wooden ships destined primarily for the lime trade.
So you see, it was a veritable parade of sail back and forth into Rockland Harbor, carrying all kinds of goods in. They used to say wood in and lime out. That was one of the major cargoes of the time. Limestone, hot lime they called it. Hot lime is what they used to make mortar and cement. And they're building places like New York and Boston and all those cities down there. And they wanted that limestone down there.
During the mid to later part of the 19th century, there was so much traffic in and out of Rockland Harbor that it was regularly among the top 4 ports of entry in all of the United States.
Say Boston, Philadelphia, New York, and Rockland, Maine. There are so many vessels going in and out of Rockland that it's impossible to count all of them, but that lighthouse keeper in Owl's Head tried to do that in 1893. He counted the sailing vessels. There were over 6,000 of them came in and out of Rockland Harbor that one year, 1893.
Rockland shipbuilding reached its peak in the 1850s with the launching of 22 ships in 1853 and 21 vessels in 1854.
Of course, to build a vessel, you needed certain characteristics of the property: a gentle sloping land with clear water behind it so you could get a vessel afloat. Building it was not the problem, it was getting it in the water. Then the way they built them was, of course, they built a vessel and then they built a set of launching ways, temporary launching ways usually, underneath them. Rockland built many vessels, square riggers, the barks and ships and brigs or half brigs, and even clipper ships, attributed with building 10 clipper ships, the most famous of which was the Red Jacket, which was built right down the street, about a quarter mile from here.
One of the crowning achievements of the shipbuilding industry in Rockland was Red Jacket, a clipper ship launched in November 1853. The ship set a speed record in crossing the Atlantic Ocean, New York to Liverpool, of 13 days and 1 hour.
There's a bustle in the shipyard of the builder Deacon George, a pounding of the hammers and a ringing of the forge, a smell of tar and oakum and the tread of hustling feet, and masts are standing stark and haughty, waiting for the sheet. The builder looks her over with his keen blue Thomas eyes, and nods in satisfaction at the sleekness of his prize. By Jove, he thunders to his men as he gives his thigh a slap, I'll bet her full square riggin' she'll put Rockland on the map. And channel boats she overhauls as if their anchors drag. We scun 'em all to Liverpool, yells the captain all agog. Just 13 days, 1 hour, 25 minutes for the crossing by her log. There's a roaring cheer of welcome from the dock by English cars, as they greet the fastest clipper to fly the stripes and stars. and Rockland hearts are happy this bright January day as they clasp the hand of George Thomas, who sent her down the way. Ethel Thomas Cezak.
No name is more identified with the Mid-Coast maritime heritage than that of Snow. Snow Shipyard was synonymous with shipbuilding in Rockland in the 20th century because for much of that time it was the only shipbuilding and maintenance facility in the community. But the Snow family's involvement with seafaring goes back to the region's earliest days, when many of the male Snows were sailors and boat builders.
They were very well known and were very well respected as quality builders. The Snow Yard built a whole fleet of very stout and handsome three-masted schooners that were all involved in carrying granite. They found a niche that they just, instead of building coal schooners or lumber schooners, because there were a lot of people competing in that trade, they realized that what they should do is build a bigger stone carrier.
The family has added several more generations and master mariners since 1865, including a Navy admiral. And the Mid-Coast Maine Snows trace their American maritime heritage all the way back to the Mayflower.
So there was a great number employed in the shipyards. And many of the shipbuilders, by the way, the working men, came from Nova Scotia. And there are people of families here that can trace their ancestry back to Nova Scotia because they came here because of the opportunity to work in the yards. Building a four-masted schooner, it'd be 150 men, and it would take them anywhere from 8 to 10 months to build it. And it was all hand tools for the most part. The amount of iron that went into one of these vessels to fasten it together, you just didn't go down to the hardware store and buy a nail. The blacksmith had to make all the ironwork for the masts and booms and gaffs and so forth for the rig, as well as sharpen the men's tools if necessary. Then when the World War I ended, that all evaporated, and those same vessels were found tied up at anchor, being very idle in the 1920s, and some of them, that was the last thing they ever did. It was a shame, but they'd served their purpose.
Oak that grew on granite fashioned her stalwart frame, and brawny New England built her and gave her a Yankee name. The cool, shrewd head that sailed her was of that stout, grim stock that fled from king and bishop to land on Plymouth Rock. They heard the call of commerce whenever the four winds blew. They could take a hand at fighting, the captain, the mate, and the crew. Their stout ship spurned the water away from her sharp-edged bow. Oh, the glory of her sailing is with us even now. She passes. The good ship passes. The pride of an elder day, and the vision of her haunts not the young lads at their play. The call that lured their fathers died down and does not rise, for the old shipyards are empty beneath New England skies. She passes. The good ship passes, haunted by steam wrath white, but her bearing is bold as ever, though she enters the port of night. O piping winds, pipe only your mellowest minor strain. New England's pride is passing and will not come again. Anna E. Coghlan.
Despite the lure of the West, the 1870s brought renewed economic growth in Rockland, and additional evidence that East Thomaston's new name had been fortuitously chosen back in 1850. Not only was the city's economy still anchored by lime rock, but there was competition on the horizon from another rock. While the foundation of Rockland's economy had rested on the lime and shipbuilding industries throughout the 19th century, in the years following the Civil War, several Rockland businesses were organized to quarry granite on islands and peninsulas of Penobscot Bay. The largest of these businesses were Bodwell and the Hurricane Island Granite Company. An excerpt from a local newspaper illustrates the growth experienced on area island communities due to the granite industry. Carver's Harbor, the largest village, had been but a half-dozen unpainted houses and an old schoolhouse, and the roads were but little better than sheep paths. Now the harbor is as trim-looking a village as one would want to see, has 5 stores in and around it, a spacious schoolhouse of the latest style, a fine packet to connect it with the rest of the world twice a week, and the hum of well-paid industry all about it. Skilled laborers and craftsmen, many of them European immigrants, fashioned paving blocks, columns, and complex architectural details for buildings, monuments, and bridges in cities across the country. The granite revolution was propelled by a strong growth in demand for the rock as a popular commercial building and road paving material in the last half of the 19th and into the early 20th century. But by the end of the century, the granite trade was beginning to decline as building and paving patterns changed. The fashion for monumental stone buildings gave way to steel and concrete, and macadam was supplanting paving stones. Changes in construction tastes altered the economies on several islands along the Maine coast. Once vibrant, granite-cutting-driven communities on Hurricane and Dix Islands disappeared almost overnight, and the deep quarries that had fed the granite boom filled with groundwater. "'Twas in the 80s I began work here, when all great cities paved their streets with blocks. A nickel apiece they were, and I could reel 200 blocks or more each day. The reeling wasn't much like the reeling now. Most anything would do. Along this hump were 50 motions clicking every day. The happiest hours of my life. Ah, them were jolly days. I never thought they'd leave us as they did. The price sent down, and cities paved with asphalt rumour blocks. The young folks moved away, but we were old, too old to think of other towns as home." From the Paving Quarry by Wilbert Snow. The legacy of the granite industry lives on in Rockland and around the nation. Many of the immigrant families who first came to the area to work in granite stayed and took up other pursuits, such as fishing. Today, their ancestors are part of the rich tapestry that makes up the fabric of the community. Around the nation, the legacy is represented in splendid buildings and other structures. In Washington, D.C., they include the Eisenhower Executive Office Building, the U.S. Post Office, and the Library of Congress. There are large banks and post offices in Boston, Cleveland, Chicago, and Kansas City, the Brooklyn Bridge, and a celebrated project that produced 8 columns for the Cathedral of St. John the Divine in New York City. By 1900, Maine's long, deep-water harbor's coastline no longer gave it the commercial edge it had enjoyed a century earlier. As the ground transportation revolution accelerated the country's westward fixation, and commercial shipbuilding turned from wood and sail to steel and steam, Maine receded further from the center of the action. The more miles of railroad track that were laid, and in the 20th century, the more miles of highway that were built, the more coastal Maine's economic development slowed. The coming of automobiles and trucks wiped out the use of commercial sailing vessels almost entirely. While fishing was the oldest commercial activity in the mid-coast region, it was primarily a local and small enterprise until the second decade of the 20th century. The Gulf of Maine teemed with a great variety of ground fish and shellfish. By the 1880s, small, independently owned fishing boats were selling their ground fish catches to several Rockland wholesale dealers for the retail fresh fish trade, as well as to dealers specializing in the smoking or salting and drying of fish. The onset of World War I saw a spike in demand for American canned products to replace meat and fish supplies shut off from Europe. Small herring, packed as sardines, became a special favorite for both military and domestic consumption. Several entrepreneurs operated canneries on the Rockland waterfront because it was near herring fishing grounds, and sardine packing went on to become an important part of the community's fish processing industry for over half a century. In 1939, the F.J. O'Hara Company moved to Rockland from Boston and set the stage for strong fish processing growth during World War II and the post-war boom years. Rockland boats landed 325,000 pounds of ocean perch in 1939, and by 1944, the catch exceeded 12 million pounds. The fishing fleet expanded accordingly, and Rockland soon became Maine's leading fishing port and, for a few years, rivaled Gloucester, Massachusetts, for second place behind Boston among New England fishing ports. Rockland's remaining shipbuilder, Snow's Shipyard, enjoyed a resurgence of activity, winning contracts to construct wooden naval vessels, which provided hundreds of much-needed jobs. Other local businesses also secured military contracts and hired more workers, including most of the city's fish processing plants. Pent-up demand for goods and services in short supply during the war years, combined with the influx of returning servicemen and women wanting to make up for lost time, produced a post-war boom. The Second World War had an unexpected effect on another resource being harvested from the seas of Penobscot Bay: seaweed. In 1936, a Frenchman, Victor C. Legloic, formed the Algin Corporation of America with Robert Holt. They located the company on Crockett's Point, on land previously used for lime processing and storage. Their mission was to produce a product called alginate, a food additive made from brown seaweed known as kelp that would be harvested from the waters of Penobscot Bay. Once the production process was firmly in place, Le Gloic planned to relocate the company to his native France. But in 1940, his plans were derailed when Hitler invaded Paris. With the Nazis occupying his homeland, his plan became untenable, and the Algin Corporation remained in Rockland. Today, the plant continues to operate and employs over 100 area individuals. The fishing industry remained strong through the 1960s, but driven by overfishing, the catch began to decline in the early 1970s. By that decade's end, supplies of several species had disappeared or were in ever more dwindling supply. And by the mid-1980s, the ocean perch era was pretty much over for Rockland. But as the ground fishing industry suffered, another inhabitant of Penobscot Bay would come to take its place. Before the late 1700s, lobsters were so plentiful that they were gathered by hand along the shoreline. Lobsters were so abundant at this time that what is now considered so special was used as bait for fishing, fertilizer, or poor people's food. Those who consumed the most lobster at this point were prisoners, apprentices, and servants. In fact, some servants added to their contracts that they would only be served shellfish twice a week because they were being fed so much lobster. In the late 1700s, a boat known as a smack, which had tanks with holes in them that allowed seawater to circulate inside of them, were introduced in Maine to transport live lobsters. It wasn't until the mid-19th century that lobster trapping, which was first practiced in Maine, became the most popular way to collect lobsters. It was in the 1880s that lobsters finally began to lose their bad reputation. They were beginning to be served in diners, particularly in Boston and New York, and from there, prices rose. By the time World War II began, lobster was considered to be a delicacy. The lobster industry became an important part of Rockland's economy in the 1920s. During that prosperous decade, demand for Maine lobster accelerated. Rockland was in a strong position to meet that growing demand. The lobster catch in Knox County exceeded that of all other areas in the state, and Rockland's rail connection quickly established it as the key distribution center in the wholesale market. Early leading local dealers included A.C. McClune and Company. While in the early years A.C. McClune sold dried fish and canned fruits and vegetables in addition to selling lobsters, the operation eventually grew to become the largest lobster dealer in the United States. Rockland eventually marketed and promoted its way to becoming known as the lobster capital of the world, a title it still claims today, as evidenced by the tonnage of lobsters harvested in the Rockland area and celebrated by the huge crowds that gather annually for the 5-day Maine Lobster Festival. In Rockland in the late 1940s through the 1950s, the Lobster Festival was the premier event every summer. From the crowning of the sea goddess to the appearance of King Neptune, the Saturday morning parade, the consumption of lobsters from the world's largest lobster cooker, and the growing variety of other activities at the public landing, the festival was essentially a volunteer-produced celebration of Rockland as the lobster capital of the world that brought the community together and lured lots of people from around the state and from away. While the inaugural Lobster Festival was held in Camden in 1947, the event shifted to Rockland the following year, and Rockland has been the festival's home for more than 70 years.
But there is still an ethic, a reality that's very much alive. You know, if you don't have to scratch too deep, you know, if you know where you are down on the waterfront in Rockland, and you can still smell diesel and sweat and blood and, you know, hydraulic fluid and fish. I hope and I expect that Rockland is well positioned to have some continuity in its working waterfront. I mean, you know, I'm sure, coast of Maine, which is over 3,000 miles, if you look at all the saltwater influence shoreline, all of it is 3,200 miles, 3,500 miles, only 20 miles of which, less than 20 miles of which, is still working waterfront. And Rockland has a not insignificant amount of that 20 miles that's left in the whole state of Maine. So I think Rockland maintaining its relationship to the sea, to the bay, and what lies beyond is really critical in helping to define the essence, the character, the mojo of Rockland.
The sea is forever quivering, the shore is forever still, and the boy who is born in a seacoast town is born with a dual will. The sand and the rocks and the beaches inveigle him to stay, while every wave that breaches is a nudge to be up and away. Wilbert Snow. The ending of the fish packing and rendering industry in Rockland paved the way for a revitalized waterfront that has in turn contributed to the overall health of the downtown economy. When the City Council authorized the hiring of Rockland's first full-time harbor master in 1992, there were only 80 moorings in the harbor, the result of a decline in the fishing industry and Rockland's negative reputation as a yachting destination, a reputation that had prevailed for decades.
In my mind, one of the great things that happened was Rockland got itself a great harbor master. That was the late Ken Rich. Wonderful guy, great guy. Really cared. Everything he did was done with passion, with gusto, and he really cared. He's a people guy. And he took, you know, Rockland's harbor and basically turned it around. What was once a joke, you know, recreational, you know, yachties wouldn't be found dead in Rockland Harbor. They would not sully, you know, their glistening halls with the waters of, you know, this sort of, you know, perceived industrial hellhole. The old saying, you know, Camden by the sea, Rockland by the smell. Well, there was truth to it, of course.
By the time of the first full-time harbor master's departure in 1997, the number of moorings had mushroomed to more than 400. By 2010, there were 650 moorings.
It's practically unrecognizable today from what was there back into the 70s, early 80s. It's really quite extraordinary. And I lay a lot of that on to the credit of Ken Rich. And I think that spirit, that vision, that the standards that he created have carried through and live today. A series of successive, really good harbor masters have kept the harbor right up there, functioning, facilities, there's energy, it's clean, Rockland Harbor, a destination, who would have thunk it?
In the beginning decades of the 20th century, the sudden decline of granite quarrying and the advent of the automobile combined to decimate many of the economies on the islands located along the Maine coast. In the 1890s, there were 300 year-round unbridged island communities in the Gulf of Maine. Today, there are only 15. In 1983, the Island Institute was founded by Philip Conkling and co-founded by Peter Ralston, focusing its attention on these troubled island communities.
The vision, which was really Philip's for the Institute, started to coalesce. And there were a few of us there at the very beginning. Philip and I technically co-founded it. There were certainly other people around then, but the idea was the Institute would help year-round island communities sustain themselves, and from there umbilically connected to the offshore island year-round communities or the mainland towns. We knew from get-go that we wanted to base the Institute, headquarter the Institute in Rockland. The ferries go out of Rockland, of course, to service the islands, but there was no doubt ever that we would base the Institute in Rockland. A working town, not a fancy town, a working town. One of the best things we ever did.
The Institute delivers on its mission through its programs to keep island living affordable for a wide range of families, through its programs to preserve and strengthen the working waterfront for fishing and other marine-based businesses. In addition, they work to help islanders diversify and broaden their economic bases in the 21st century by improving educational opportunities for island families. Today, the Institute is working to build coalitions to meet the challenges facing Maine's islands and other coastal communities, with an emphasis on the impact of climate change and the resulting rising sea levels.
The Institute is a community-based and community-focused. It's about people. But you can't look at communities, you can't look at people on the coast, the human literal zone, if you will, without being intensely aware of the environment. And I've been out of the Institute since 2010, but I'm really glad to see the continued, indeed the heightened focus on and attention paid to, and work being done focused on environmental stuff, principally climate change, and how it is rapidly, seriously changing things here.
Perhaps most important to the long-term sustainability of the 15 Maine islands with year-round residents is the 6-vessel fleet that makes up the Maine State Ferry Service. The ferries are a critical lifeline between the island communities and the mainland, and no organization is more vital to maintaining this lifeline than the Proc Marine Company. Founded in 1938 and headquartered in Rockland, Proc Marine is committed to preserving the quality of life of Maine's island communities and the Gulf of Maine region as a whole. The company continues Rockland's rich maritime heritage by playing a major role in shoreland stabilization and commercial harbor development.
Rockland is a destination, and they want to see working waterfront, and they want to see, art. They want to see the Farnsworth, the little Maine coastal city that could, and has, and that's Rockland.
In addition to the lobster capital of the world, in recent years Rockland has acquired another moniker, that of the art capital of Maine. At first, it may seem that this newest designation is a turn away from the maritime history so prevalent throughout Rockland's journey. However, a closer look at the institution that formed the foundation of Rockland's emergence into today's creative economy reveals yet another tributary of rich maritime heritage. The Farnsworth family traces its roots back 4 generations in mid-coast Maine, highlighted by a celebrated sea captain and a prosperous lime baron. But it is the reclusive daughter of William Farnsworth IV that connects the maritime heritage and Farnsworth family legacy to Rockland's most recent reimagining. Lucy Farnsworth was a recluse for much of her adult life, yet this remarkable woman, whose devotion to her family was preeminent, did care about her community and left a legacy that has become the cornerstone of Rockland's remarkable renewal. Lucy was the sole remaining Farnsworth at the time of her death in 1935. In her will, she specified that she wanted a building constructed to honor her father, that building to be labeled the William A. Farnsworth Memorial Library. The first floor would house a store, and the second was to be used for a public library and art gallery. The trustees of her estate began the evolution of her bequest, building a collection of art that was at the heart of the transformation from a library with an art gallery into the Farnsworth Art Museum we know today. Like the history of the city itself, much of the art that forms the Farnsworth's permanent collection has themes and imagery connected to the rich maritime traditions of the city in which it resides.
But I think thanks to the energy, the draw, the pull, almost the magic of the Farnsworth and its collection and its gravitational pull, regionally, Main Street has filled with a lot of art-related businesses, which is great. I mean, real jobs, real money, real pull to a lot of people.
Today, the community's resurgence is driven by the splendor of its natural setting. Whether visitors come simply to enjoy the tranquility of the sea or to capture it in an original work of art, Rockland's continued success is built upon a solid foundation of its rich maritime heritage, linked to the ultimate natural resource, its sublime location at the mouth of the expansive, breathtakingly beautiful Penobscot Bay.